In this case, we're looking not for a solution to next year. It took them 100 years to get to where they're at now, where they have this problem. Because of how diverse this problem is, there's no pipe that we can go and plug up the end of it. This is a little bit of fertilizer on every single farm field in the entire watershed. Eventually, all that fertilizer is washing downstream, straight into the lake, and plants love fertilizer, and the algae that's in the lake grows from it. Right? Working through it with this community, we started to have to talk about numbers. And that number is, how much money are you willing to invest, right, in the long-term solution here? Right? And this gets into that really, really complicated space of lots and lots of people working together. Why don't we like group projects? Well, let's start adding in thousands of dollars a year in additional taxes to pay for your collective problem and see how much disagreement we can get. But this is actually a really fun space to work in with communities to think about these issues. And one of the reasons for that I mentioned is that this picture here, I'll just pause here for a second. This is a meeting that I ran on a very similar project to the one I just showed you, except it was 50 degrees below zero on a Sunday morning in February in Wisconsin, and we had 200 people show up to a meeting at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday because they cared that much about what was going on. Right, the 50 degrees below zero thing is, I'm not built for that kind of weather. I don't know if you've ever experienced that kind of weather, but it is not what most people would go out in. And this is the thing, is that we think about how hard it would be to get all of these stakeholders to work together. I love doing this. I love getting groups of people together. I know at the front end we're going to have disagreement. I know that things are going to be challenging. The picture up on the screen, this is actually from work that I did on Green Bay in Wisconsin. So Green Bay Wisconsin is a hand state, and it's got a thumb sticking off the side. This is Door County. Green Bay is the water body in between there. It's part of Lake Michigan. There is a dead zone, very similar to the dead zone that's in the Gulf of Mexico that comes off the Mississippi River. This one's localized to a smaller watershed. We know how to fix the problem. When I first got asked to get involved in this, though, I literally went over, gave a presentation, and was driving the 2.5 hours home. And on the way home, I was getting calls from all these people that got my card. And they were like, well, we didn't want to say anything in front of those other people, but they're doing everything wrong. And then I'd answer the phone 5 minutes later. We didn't want to say anything in front of those other people, but they're doing everything wrong, right? This was the community I walked into. And I spent 5 years working with this community, trying to help them think about common goals, things that they actually might care about collectively, they might want to work towards together. We brought in business interests, we brought in the local hospitals, and eventually we brought in the Packers. Kid you not, we actually held a series of meetings at Lambeau Field. It turns out people will show up when you both serve beer and host the event at Lambeau Field, right? And so, but what we managed to do in this particular case was we got groups of people that had been fighting for decades to come together to actually sign a formal agreement that they were going to work towards a common goal, right? This is tough work. Again, what's great about working in groups, I think you said it, you don't have to do all the work. I couldn't have done any of this. I'm relatively good at standing in front of a room full of people that really don't like each other and figuring out a way to get them to talk to one another. That's my piece of the puzzle. I have lots and lots of other partners involved in this, right? And we're able to kind of move in this direction where we can kind of bring people together. We're working on similar things with my students up in Northwest Indiana. Northwest Indiana, Gary is one of those industrial hubs of the state of Indiana. Lots and lots of challenges. There's racial challenges to working in Gary. I kid you not, the day after a black mayor was elected in the city of Gary, most of the city council seceded from the city and took land with them and created a new community where all of the white people could go live. It's wild. This is not that long ago, right? We can actually show by just tracking the change in racial demographics in that community what happened. It went from a community that was about 50-50 in terms of having a white population and an African-American population. And it literally, over the next 2.5 decades, it basically completely went to a community that's about 90% African-American at this point in time. Lots and lots of structural racism is baked into that problem. But these are the issues that we're dealing with. Long legacy of environmental degradation. One of my colleagues here at Purdue the other day shared with me, when we talk about brownfields, so these are industrial sites where the land's been contaminated by the industrial manufacturing that happened there. She said, in white communities we call them Superfund sites because Superfund comes with funding and they get cleaned up. In places like Gary we call them brownfields. Brownfields is just you don't want to be on that property and you certainly don't want to be messing with the soil on that property, but they don't get cleaned up. And that sounds like an extreme way to think about this, but this is the context we're actively trying to work within, right? In dealing with things like the Calumet River up there is a polluted river, but it's the river that runs through their community. If they want a river trail like we're building here in Lafayette, they've got to figure out how to clean this up, how to start addressing some of the contamination issues that are happening here. And so these are the issues that we're working through today. They're at a place where we were here in Lafayette 30 years ago, where 30 years ago nobody recreated on the Wabash. Today we host community events. In the summertime when you're all gone, there's actually canoe races that happen on the Wabash. There's lots and lots of recreation. It's actually, this stretch here in Lafayette's really, really easy to get out in a boat and spend time on. And so these are the things we're working with communities on. This is an example. This was actually the example that I think it's the reason why I'm talking to you this afternoon. This is a small community, and again, communities are dealing with challenges. Here in the state of Indiana, we have 4 counties that are growing. We happen to be in one of them. Growth in most cases here in the Midwest means thriving economy. Okay, there's 92 counties in the state of Indiana. So just do the math and figure out that while some of them, they're probably holding their own, there's about 13 counties that are stable population-wise. It means we have 70-some counties that realistically are losing people, their economy's down. It is very, very difficult to think about long-term what's going to happen there. And then communities like Connersville, Indiana, which I'm going to talk about just for a minute here. Connersville got hit exceptionally hard by the opioid crisis, and heroin on the streets of Connersville, they have the highest death rate per capita of any city in Indiana from heroin overdoses. As a result, this is a place where those who can go to college and then never come back. As a result, companies don't move jobs here. Right? The people that remain, right? The poverty trap that exists on the far side of this, right? You would think, there's just this desperation. But what you find when you start working with communities like this is there are people that know that they've got the bones to work with. This was a thriving community at one point in time. How do we go forward from this? So I got invited into this project in the park that you actually see here. It's called 2nd Street Park. I had to give needle warnings to my students for the first time ever when working on a park project here about watching where you put your feet, not to get stabbed by a needle. I don't believe we actually found any that day, but this was something that the public health officer had advised me to do. We went down and spent time with the community, and my students came back to campus, and this is what they do in their studio. They came back, they started drawing up ideas. We shared those ideas with the community partner, got feedback on them. And you start to see in this small park, and you can kind of see this like 1970s playground equipment, right? Nothing about this is safe. They're starting to think through bigger challenges here like universal access. It means if you're in a wheelchair, if you have limited mobility issues, right? If you have, site limitations, that you can still use this space, right? And so students are working through some of those challenges. But they're also trying to think about how do you represent the community? How do you represent the good things in this community? This community, and actually this park, sits right next to a railroad. There's a huge danger issue, which is why you see this you see the fence design in this student's work here, right? Because railroad right next to small children playing seems like a bad idea. But the railroad here is actually, it's a historical railroad, and they attract 100,000 visitors a year from all over the U.S. to come and take a ride on this historic railroad. They also do Thomas the Tank Engine a couple of weeks a year as well, right? And so, definitely some of that. But this is what the students do, is they go through and they work through these different ideas, these different ways of seeing the future for this park space. And we're able to take that, in this case, I have a partnership with the National Park Service, and specifically their community assistance program called Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance. And we were able to take one of my former students and hire her on as a fellow. And Faith, as part of 32 projects she did for us that year, one of them was she took all those student ideas and we went down and met with the community over and over again. And some of those early challenges were like, this looks amazing. We want this big giant, pavilion that looks like a train, and Faith would come back and go, all right, to do a custom building like that, we're talking minimum $300,000. And the community went, next, right? And so we worked through all of these changes back to the core of what they were after. We then were able to actually bring in a professional landscape architecture firm to do the construction work, to actually stamp the drawings. Again, you have to be a licensed landscape architect to practice in the state of Indiana. And this park, we expected would take 5 years to fundraise for. This little town of 14,000 people, through private donations, in 9 months' time, raised all of the money that they needed to build this park, and it'll actually open here in, I'm being told, June 15th-ish, right? It's pretty amazing to see what a community that's beat down, that's the highest per capita death rate, they're pushing back because they see investing in their public space as the way forward, right? How do you improve a community that has a lot of things going wrong? We'll show everybody in a very public way that this community has strength and can move forward. That's what they're doing in this particular case. Maybe. I know one of these days this is going to fail me. Let's see if today's the day. Right, and so, yeah, we're kind of working our way through. But in that group work effort kind of way, this is just the short list of people, of different groups that we brought into this particular project. And so, I mentioned that I do a lot of work with the National Park Service, and a lot of this comes back to something that every single service project you're ever involved in, from Miller Elementary School on, there's a limited amount of time, limited amount of expertise, a limited amount of money that goes into every single service project that you're all involved in. And so the challenge for each and every one of you is people helping those community partners is that how do you expand their capacity? Some of that we would do with our ideas. It's one of the great things about bringing students through programs like EPICS into communities, right? They have access to all of you, right? It's amazing. You bring in, students as partners, how many of you, I'm trying to think, how many of you work on a project here local, like in the city of Lafayette? A handful of you, right? How many of you are from that city? That's what I expected, right? Imported talent. That's one way that we can grow capacity. In this case, partnerships is another way that we can grow capacity. Partnership allows me to do all kinds of amazing things. And so working with the Nature Conservancy, so those of you not from Indiana, sometimes I find myself as tourism spokesperson, right? About an hour north of campus, basically, about an hour north of campus, there is a 10,000 acre restored prairie that is just absolutely amazing. And if you're really struggling with Indiana's cornfields and you need to see something else, right? Kankakee Sands up in Newton County is a finished restoration of this 10,000 acre historic. And in addition to that, you can also see the bison over my shoulder, right? They have bison. Well, the Nature Conservancy is an organization. Their mission since formation has been to preserve land and protect it from all of us, protect it from people. In the last decade or so, they, along with lots of us that study human dimensions, have realized, turns out keeping people out isn't a good way to get people to care about something, right? It seems really hard as an after fact, but as an organization, really the conservation movement broadly, environmental projects, that's been our